You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Equal chances fallacies. Back in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau expressed the essence of the social justice vision when he wrote, "Of the equality which nature established among men and the inequality which they have instituted among themselves." In the kind of world envisioned by Rousseau, all classes, races, and other subdivisions of the human species would have equal chances in all endeavors, other things being equal. But the more other things there are, influencing outcomes, the lower the chances of all those other things being equal. In the real world, there is seldom anything resembling the equal outcomes that might be expected if all factors affecting outcomes were the same for everyone. Even in a society with equal opportunity, in the sense of judging each individual by the same standards, people from different backgrounds do not necessarily even want to do the same things, much less invest their time and energies into developing the same kinds of skills and talents. In American sports, for example, blacks are very overrepresented in professional basketball, whites in professional tennis, and Hispanics in Major League Baseball. In professional hockey, where there are more teams in the United States than in Canada, there are more Canadian players than American players, even though the population of the United States is more than 8 times the population of Canada. There are also more hockey players from Sweden, nearly 4,000 miles away in the NHL, than there are hockey players from California, even though the population of California is nearly 4 times the population of Sweden. Different climates are among the many other things that are not equal. Colder climates, with waterways frozen for months at a time, offer more opportunities for more people to grow up, developing the ice skating skills essential for hockey. Such climates are far more common in Canada and Sweden than in the United States in general, or California in particular. Climate differences are among numerous other differences that can facilitate the development of some capabilities in particular peoples and impede the development of other capabilities. At the heart of the social justice vision is the assumption that, because economic and other disparities among human beings greatly exceed any differences in their innate capacities, these disparities are evidence or proof of the effects of such human vices as exploitation and discrimination. These vices are in fact among the many influences that prevent different groups of people, whether classes, races, or nations, from having equal or even comparable outcomes in economic terms or other terms. But human vices have no monopoly as causes of economic and other disparities. It is especially difficult to make the case that inequalities of outcomes can be automatically assumed to have been caused by discrimination by dominant majorities against subordinate minorities, when in fact many subordinate minorities have economically outperformed dominant majorities in many countries around the world and in many periods of history. A study of the Ottoman Empire, for example, found that none of the 40 private bankers listed in Istanbul in 1912 was a Turk, even though Turks ruled the empire. Nor was any of the 34 stockbrokers in Istanbul a Turk. Of the capital assets of 284 industrial firms in the Ottoman Empire, employing 5 or more workers, 50% of these firms were owned by Greeks, and another 20% were owned by Armenians. The Ottoman Empire was by no means unique. Racial or ethnic minorities who have owned or operated more than half of whole industries in particular nations have included the Chinese in Malaysia, Germans in Brazil, Lebanese in West Africa, Jews in Poland, Italians in Argentina, Indians in East Africa, Scots in Britain, Igbos in Nigeria, and Wawaris in India. By contrast, we can read reams of social justice literature without encountering a single example of the proportional representation of different groups in endeavors open to competition. In any country in the world today, or at any time over thousands of years of recorded history. Among the many factors that can prevent equal human potentialities from producing equally developed capabilities are factors over which humans have very little control, such as geography, and other factors over which humans have no control at all, such as the past. There are innumerable things that can create unequal chances, some of which are worth examining in some detail. To begin with a very mundane example of a demonstrable inequality of capabilities, most of the leading brands of beer in the United States were created by people of German ancestry. China's Tsingtao beer was also created by people of German ancestry. Germans have also been prominent among beer producers in Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. In Europe, Germany has long been the leading producer of beer. It so happens that Germans were producing beer back in the days of the Roman Empire, when a particular people has been doing a particular thing for more than 1,000 years. Is it surprising if they tend to be more successful in that particular endeavor than others who have had no such history? Here, we are not discussing innate potential for achievements in general, but developed capabilities for doing very specific things. Whatever the combination of circumstances that may have led Germans to begin brewing beer in ancient times, the skills they developed over the many centuries since then are a fact of life today. The same is true of other groups that have developed particular skills in other particular endeavors in the past. One of many things that no individual, no institution, and no society has any control over is the past. The past is irrevocable, and, as a noted historian said, we do not live in the past, but the past in us. Germans are by no means unique in having particular things that they do better than many other peoples. Conversely, there are some things that other peoples do better than Germans. It is common, for example, to hear people speak of French cuisine or Italian cuisine, but seldom, if ever, do people speak of German cuisine or English cuisine. Yet these are all peoples and countries clustered together in Europe. Rome and Berlin are about the same distance from each other as New York and Chicago, while London and Paris are closer to each other than Los Angeles and San Francisco. The point here is that in what might seem like very similar circumstances, there can be very different histories, cultures, and outcomes in particular endeavors. Particular groups having particular skills in particular kinds of endeavors have been a common fact of life over the centuries and in countries around the world. Even if two groups happen to live in identical, tangible surroundings today, how likely would they be to have had the same environmental influences throughout all the scores of millennia of human existence? Scots have long been internationally renowned for the quality of the whiskey they produce, as the French have been for their wines. But the Scots cannot match the French in producing wine because the grapes that grow in France do not thrive in Scotland's colder climate. There is no reason whatever why the Scots should be expected to be equal to the French in producing wine, or either of them equal to the Germans in producing beer. Neither race nor racism, nor any other form of discrimination is necessary to account for such reciprocal inequalities. Nor have those who automatically invoke discriminatory biases as explanations for unequal outcomes been able to cite any country anywhere in the world that has had the proportional demographic representation which they have made a criterion. Reciprocal inequalities. While group equalities in the same endeavors are by no means common, what is common are reciprocal inequalities among groups in different endeavors. The equality among different groups of human beings, presupposed by those who regard disparities in outcomes as evidence or proof of discriminatory bias, might well be true as regards innate potentialities. But people are not hired or paid for their innate potentialities. They are hired and paid, admitted to colleges, or accepted into other desired positions on the basis of their developed capabilities, relevant to the particular endeavor. In these terms, reciprocal inequalities might suggest equal potentialities without providing any basis for expecting equal outcomes. Even groups lagging in many kinds of achievement tend, nevertheless, to have some particular endeavors where they do not merely hold their own, but excel. Groups lacking in their educational backgrounds, for example, may lag in many other endeavors for which such a background is essential. And yet, such generally lagging groups have often excelled in some other endeavors where personal talent and dedication are key factors. Sports and entertainment have long been among such endeavors, with high achievements for such American groups rising out of poverty as the Irish, blacks, and Southern whites. While group equality in either outcomes or capabilities is hard to find, it is also hard to find any ethnic or other large social group that has no endeavor in which it is above average. Reciprocal inequalities abound, even when equality does not. As we have seen, different ethnic groups dominate different American sports. One consequence of this is that the degree of inequality of group representation in American sports as a whole is not as severe as in each individual sport. A similar principle applies for similar reasons in other endeavors because of reciprocal inequalities. If one looks at wealthy, historic individuals in commerce and industry, for example, one could find Jews far more widely represented among historic leaders in retailing, finance, and garment production and sales than in the steel industry, automobile production, or coal mining. In the professions as well, groups that have similar representation in the professions as a whole can have very different representations in particular professions such as engineering, medicine, or the law. Asian American professionals are not necessarily concentrated in the same professions as Irish American professionals. Because of reciprocal inequalities, the more narrowly defined the endeavor, the less likely are different groups to be comparably represented. Yet, crusaders for social justice often decry uneven representation of groups in an individual company as evidence or proof of employer discrimination in that particular company. When different peoples evolve differently in very different settings and conditions, they can develop different talents that create reciprocal inequalities of achievements in a wide range of endeavors without necessarily creating equality or even comparability in any of those endeavors. Such reciprocal inequalities lend no support to theories of either genetic determinism or discriminatory biases as automatic explanations of inequalities. Many assumptions and phrases in the social justice literature are repeated endlessly without any empirical test. When women are statistically underrepresented in Silicon Valley, for example, some people automatically assume that to be due to sex discrimination by Silicon Valley employers. It so happens that the work done in Silicon Valley is based on an application of engineering skills, including computer software engineering, and American women receive less than 30% of the degrees in engineering. whether at the college level or the postgraduate level. When American men receive less than 20% of the undergraduate degrees in education and only 22% and 32% of master's degrees and doctoral degrees, respectively, in the same subject, is it surprising that men are underrepresented among school teachers and women are underrepresented in engineering occupations? Comparing the statistical representation of women and men in either of these occupations is like comparing apples and oranges when their educational specializations are so different. These educational specialization decisions are usually made individually years before either the women or the men reached an employer to begin a professional career. A more general question arises when the incomes of women as a whole are compared to the incomes of men as a whole. This leaves out many specific differences in the life patterns of women and men. One of the most basic of these differences is that women are full-time, year-round workers significantly less often than men. U.S. Census Bureau data show that in 2019, there were 15 million more male full-time, year-round workers than female full-time, year-round workers. The work patterns of women include more part-time work and some whole years when many women are out of the labor force entirely, often due to staying home to take care of young children. When these and other differences in work patterns are taken into account, male-female differences in income shrink drastically and in some cases reverse. As far back as 1971, single women in their 30s who had worked continuously since leaving school were earning slightly more than men of the same description. When there are statistical differences in the representation of various ethnic groups, different patterns within these groups themselves are likewise often overlooked. A typical example of equating differences in demographic representation with employer discrimination was a headline in a San Francisco newspaper. Why are Black and Latino people still kept out of tech industry? Are Asians kept out of professional basketball? Are Californians kept out of the National Hockey League? Is equal demographic representation so widespread or so automatic in other endeavors that its absence in a particular endeavor can only be due to someone keeping particular people out? As in the case of sex differences in demographic representation in an engineering endeavor, ethnic differences in educational qualifications for an engineering career are blatant. Asian Americans have more college degrees in engineering than either Blacks or Hispanics, each of whom outnumbers Asian Americans in the U.S. population. At the PhD level, Asian Americans' engineering degrees outnumber the engineering PhDs of Blacks and Hispanics put together. Such ethnic disparities in engineering degrees are by no means peculiar to the United States. In Malaysia during the 1960s, members of the Chinese minority received 408 engineering degrees, while members of the Malay majority received just 4. When comparing different ethnic groups in a given endeavor, we are again comparing apples and oranges in terms of specialized education or other specialized preparations. In these circumstances, equal opportunity, in the sense of applying the same standards to everyone, does not produce equal outcomes, even if no one is kept out. There is no way that the Chinese in Malaysia could keep out Malay students in universities run by Malays and subject to the authority of the Malaysian government also run by Malays, and subject to the authority of the Malaysian government also run by Malays. The disparate impact standard used by courts of law for determining employer discrimination implicitly assumes something that no one can seem to find anywhere: equal demographic representation of different groups. Any number of scholarly international studies have found gross disparities common in countries around the world. One of these studies concluded, in no society have all regions and all parts of the population developed equally. Nevertheless, some justices of the U.S. Supreme Court have accepted disparate impact statistics as evidence or proof of employer discrimination, even though the Supreme Court itself has had statistical disparities more extreme than the disparities used to charge employers with discrimination. For 8 consecutive years, from 2010 to 2017, all Supreme Court justices were either Catholic or Jewish, in a country where Protestants outnumber Catholics and Jews combined. Yet, one of the most obvious reasons for doubting any negative intention or conspiracy is that these justices were appointed by presidents of both political parties, and all those presidents were Protestants. None of this denies that employer biases are a factor that can be and has been responsible for some disparities in employment outcomes. But human biases have no monopoly among the many things that prevent equal chances. Origins of inequalities. The question whether different social groups have equal or unequal capabilities in various endeavors is very different from the question whether racial or sexual differences create inherently different mental potential determined by genes. The genetic determinism assumption that reigned supreme among American intellectuals of the progressive era in the early 20th century is an irrelevant issue in this context, though it will be dealt with in Chapter 2 and has been dealt with more extensively elsewhere. If we assume for the sake of argument that every social group or even every individual has equal mental potential at the moment of conception, that would still not be enough to guarantee even equal native intelligence at birth, much less equally developed capabilities after growing up in unequal circumstances and or being culturally oriented toward different goals in different fields. Inequalities among individuals. Unequal circumstances begin in the womb. Research has shown nutritional differences among pregnant women reflected later in IQ differences among their children when these children were old enough to be tested. Mothers' intakes of various substances can have positive or negative effects on a child's IQ and general well-being. Even where we might reasonably expect to find the greatest equality of developed capabilities among children born to the same parents and raised in the same home, research going back as far as the 19th century and including countries on both sides of the Atlantic has shown that children who are the firstborn in their family have, as a group, higher average IQs, a higher rate of college completion, and are overrepresented among high achievers in a variety of endeavors. In the United States, for example, a study found that more than half the National Merit Scholarship finalists were a firstborn child, even in 5-child families, as well as in 2-child, 3-child, and 4-child families. In other words, in 5-child families, the firstborn was the finalist more often than the other 4 siblings combined. Other measures of educational success or career success have likewise shown the firstborn and an only child to be overrepresented among the top performers in various endeavors, whether in the United States or among top performers in other countries surveyed. The firstborn or an only child can have the undivided attention of both parents during a child's crucial earliest development. This is something which later siblings obviously cannot have. Conversely, children raised where there is only one parent present have been found in a number of studies to have a higher incidence of many social problems, again, both in the United States and on the other side of the Atlantic. Studies of boys raised without a father present have found them very much overrepresented among people with pathologies ranging from truancy to murder. As one study put it, these pathologies were more highly correlated with fatherlessness than with any other factor, surpassing even race and poverty. Fatherless boys had a higher than average rate of incarceration, whether they were black or white, though the incidence of fatherless boys has been higher among blacks. Not all differences between races are due to race, either in the sense of genetics or in the sense of racial discrimination. Clearly, there were no equal chances for these boys, whether they were treated fairly or unfairly by people they encountered in institutions ranging from schools to police departments. Girls were also affected negatively, as reflected in such things as higher rates of teenage pregnancy when raised by one parent. Very similar patterns of pathology were found in England, where the ethnic makeup of the underclass population is very different from that in the United States. In England, the underclass is predominantly white, but it shows many social patterns very similar to the social patterns of low-income blacks in the United States. Even though the English underclass has no legacy of slavery to be used as an automatic explanation. When American children are raised in different social classes with different child-rearing practices, the chances of these children growing up with equal capabilities in adulthood can be seriously reduced. Research has shown that children raised by parents with professional occupations hear more than 3 times as many words per hour as children raised in families on welfare. Moreover, these are far more often positive and encouraging words when the parents are professionals, and more often negative and discouraging words when the family is on welfare. Can anyone seriously believe that children spending their formative years growing up in homes this different are likely to be the same as others in school, on a job, or elsewhere? In putting assumptions to the test of facts, a clear distinction must be maintained between equal potentialities at the beginning of life and equally developed capabilities later on. Some social justice advocates may implicitly assume that various groups have similar developed capabilities so that different outcomes appear puzzling. But when it comes to actual performance capabilities, a man is not even equal to himself, either physically or mentally, at different stages of his life, much less equal to all other people in their varying stages of life. Inequalities among groups. The seemingly invincible fallacy at the heart of the social justice vision is that large categories of people, classes, races, nations, would tend to be either equal or at least comparable in their outcomes in various endeavors, if it were not for some discriminatory bias that has intervened to produce the large disparities we see around us. Yet different groups with different median ages, varying by a decade or two, are unlikely to be equal in endeavors requiring either the physical vitality of youth or the experience that comes with age. When Japanese Americans have a median age of 52 and Mexican Americans have a median age of 28, their different representation in different occupations and at different income levels is hardly surprising. If these two groups were identical in every other respect, age differences alone would still be enough to make them differ in incomes, since middle-aged Americans have higher median incomes than Americans in their 20s. With nations, as with classes, races, or ethnic groups, age differences alone are enough to make equal economic or other outcomes very unlikely. There are whole nations whose populations have a median age over 40, Germany, Italy, Japan, and other nations whose median ages are under 20, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Angola. Why should anyone expect a nation where half the population are infants, young children, and teenagers to have the same work experience and education, the same human capital, as a nation where half the population is 40 years old or older.